Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Shooting Straight, Living Life in Truth. I am Charles, and I am your host for the evening. I will be flying solo this evening, so bear with me as I interact with you guys, the computer, and a few other things in order to make this happen tonight, all right? But anyway, tonight we are going to be discussing and talking about my experiences in advanced individual training with the United States Army. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, that's where we get trained in our MOS, our military occupational skill. Basically, what it boils down to is everyone is an infantryman at the bottom line, the base route. That's your job, is an infantryman to fight a war. However, in order to support the actual infantrymen who get that primary MOS, there's other job skills and supporting roles that need to happen, and that's where the advanced individual training comes in. That's where everybody gets their advanced training in the individual jobs that they're going to do. So with that quick explanation, let's go ahead and get a word from our sponsors. Oop, wrong video. Sorry about that, guys. Give me just a second. That one didn't queue up like I expected, so here we go.
Are you twisted enough for Twisted Minds escape rooms? Then check us out at twistedminds.com and book an adventure today. You can choose between Camp Calico or the mysteries of Vanished. How about travel back in time to 1840s California and visit Digger's General Store? Or get ready, coming late spring, early summer 2021, a little bit of mayhem at Twisted Minds escape rooms in Palm Coast. Check us out at twistedminds.com or give us a call at 888-92-TWIST. We'll be waiting.
Oh, here we go. Sorry about that, guys. I forgot to turn the mixer up for you. But anyway, make sure to check out Twisted Minds Escape Rooms, one of the best escape rooms in the state of Florida, the best in Northeast Florida. So make sure you check them out next time you're in Palm Coast. Now, with that said, let's get on to our subject, advanced individual training. Now, for me personally, I actually went through two different AITs because I held two different MOSs while I was in the U.S. Army. When I originally signed up, I signed up to be a chaplain's assistant, which back then was considered a 71 mic. Now it is called a 56 mic. And back then we were, the AIT for the chaplaincy corps was at Fort Monmouth, which was in New Jersey. Now it's, if I remember Fort Jackson is where it's at now, and the MOS designation is no longer the 71 Lima, but 71 Lima, or 71 Mike, but it's now 56 Mike. And a lot has changed. So when I went online to try and find a picture of Fort Monmouth and to show you guys, I had a hard time finding one from back when I went through AIT the first time, which was in 1988. And Fort Monmouth has done a lot of changing since then. Because I believe they ended up moving to Fort Jackson back in '96, I want to say it was. But anyway, Fort Monmouth has done a lot of changing since I went. And so the closest thing that I could find was, oops, wrong button. Sorry about that, guys. Closest image that I could find of Fort Monmouth the way it was when I went was this one. And if you look at this setup, the building that has the red encirculation there, that's the building that my barracks was in. And looking at this image, boy, it brings back a lot of memories. A lot of memories. I had a fantastic time there at Fort Monmouth. Got into a little bit of trouble when I was there, but nothing major. But nevertheless, hey, I was young. I was 18 years old. I did dumb stuff, you know. Um, anyway, that was the barracks that I stayed in. And if I remember correctly, looking from right to left on the building, if you went into that first entrance there, going from right to left there, that entranceway there was where our CQ desk was at. And if you went inside, up the stairs to the second floor and to the right, that's the bay that I stayed in. And we used to come out and do PT in that field there in the middle, in that big parking lot down there at the bottom of the field, right between the field and the two buildings going vertical. That was actually still part of the field. That wasn't a parking lot then. The only parking lot near that field was up towards the top of the screen there. If you look all the way up to the top, you can see another set of cars or something like that up there. But that whole thing was one big field. And we used to go out there and do PT in the morning, i.e. physical training. That's where we did our push-ups and all that kind of stuff. And when we would go on our 2-mile runs, especially like formation runs and stuff, it was that field that we would run around. And we would go around that thing 4 times. And I tell you what, when I was in the Army, that was the hardest thing for me to do, was run in formation, because as tall as I am, most everybody else was shorter than me. So their strides when they were running were shorter. And I had a hard time being able to stretch out my stride to a comfortable pace. So many times during AIT, I would do that formation run, and then in the afternoon, I would end up having to go out and do more running and run around that field a few times, just to get the stretch in my stride out to actually improve on my run. Because usually in the formation runs, you're running much slower than what you would have to for the PT test. And when you get to a point where you're actually at a higher physical fitness level than what a formation run requires of you, you can actually digress in your physical fitness. So in order to keep up with mine, I would have to go out and run around the field a few times. And when we did our 5-mile runs, there's a road over there to the left of the building that was my barracks. That building that road didn't exist like that back when I went to AIT. It was a straight road similar to this one over here on the right, you see in the upper right hand corner. But what we would do, we would come out when we would do those 5-mile runs, because when we did those, that was all we did that day, aside from a few quick calisthenic type warm-up exercises. But we would do our PT right there in that field area in front of the entryway where the CQ is, and the whole company would be strung all the way along that yardway there, and we would do our warm-ups, and then we would take off and go down that road, go back up into what was then what we called the back 40, i.e. a training area, places where we would do bivouacs, i.e. set up camps and stuff, and do our field training exercises and that stuff in order to graduate. But we would go down that road, back up into the back 40 a little ways, and then come back out on the opposite side over here, coming down that road on the opposite barracks, and then come back across to finish up with 2 laps around that field. And then we would finish up, and then we would go to chow, i.e. go to breakfast. But anyway, that was our barracks. And once training got started, it of course would start off with the most generic stuff in order to warm you up, get you used to the routine of your day and what was going to happen at AIT. Now, at AIT, you still have drill sergeants. You didn't get rid of the drill sergeant, but the drill sergeants at AIT were much more relaxed. Your first couple of weeks, they would act just like your basic training drill sergeants would. But once you enter into the second phase, which would be white phase, again, it was set up similar to the basic training with red, white, and blue phases. But once you entered into the second phase, i.e. white phase, they would ease up quite a bit, and be more like you would expect a normal NCO on regular active duty kind of thing to be like. Now, I mean, they weren't easy. They weren't pushovers. They still cracked a whip every now and then when people royally messed up. But for the most part, they started easing up on you because what they were trying to do was prepare you and slowly bring you down off of the hardcore attitude and mentality that got developed during basic training, and bring you back more into a daily life kind of mindset. Still maintaining military discipline, still maintaining all the military type stuff, because most people were, going active duty or doing like National Guard type stuff, but mostly they were going to active duty, so they had things geared to where they would wind you down from the basic training and get you set and ready for active duty life during your training here at AIT. And so once you started getting into some of your, completing some of your basic type AIT training, like for me being a chaplain's assistant, that would have included things like setting up the chapel for services, because in between services at each of the chapels, you'd have multiple services depending on what kind of chaplains or what denomination the chaplains were associated with. You would have to go in and set the chapel up for that particular chaplain. Like, say, one chaplain might be a Catholic chaplain, another chaplain might have been a Lutheran, another one might have been a Presbyterian, another one might have been a Pentecostal or charismatic, or some, stuff along those lines. One might have even been Jewish. We had very few Jewish chaplains at the time, and usually those had been around a while, so they were usually higher up in the chain of command, so to speak. So you didn't really get those at the battalion level, which is where your basic unit ministry team would be. Now, when I say unit ministry team, I'm referring to essentially a 2-person unit within a unit. The unit ministry team consisted usually of a chaplain and the chaplain's assistant. They were essentially their own entity. However, they were usually attached to the S1 section, i.e. the admin section. So we were always part of the headquarters element of the the battalion-sized unit. But this would be one of our basic jobs, is to transition the chapel from one service to the next, depending on the denomination of the chaplain that was going to be doing the next service. So among doing those things would be hanging these kind of things up, making adjustments to various imageries and tapestries, whether or not we allowed the stained glass windows to be completely visible, or whether we shut them with curtains or whatever. It usually depended on what the chaplain felt and what the chaplain wanted to do. Generally speaking, the curtain stayed open. But anyway, I digress and get into minor details with that. But one of the other things that we used to do in the process of setting up for chapel services and whatnot, we would have to set up the altars, which would include placing the cross or crucifix on the table on the altar, opening up the Bible that was up there to a particular passage or to a particular point that the minister was going to be speaking on that particular day. Because a lot of times they had this book up there that would be broken down like basically on topics. So if they were talking about faith that particular day, then we would open it up to the chapter on faith, or whatever particular aspect of faith that they were going to be talking about that particular day, and would basically have an outline of everything that the minister would be doing. When we had the non-liturgical type chaplains, like the Charismatics, the Pentecostals, in other particular types of denominations and stuff, doing a service, then they wouldn't use those books. So again, you had to know when to use it, when not to use it. I forget a lot of the names for it now. But part of our training was also knowing and understanding the names for the liturgical items. And then we would be responsible for bringing those out, setting those up. We would also be responsible for assisting with the servicing of communion and things like that. Part of our job was basically, as a chaplain's assistant, you were basically the supply person for the unit ministry team. So whatever supplies that you had, you were responsible for inventorying them, ordering stuff if you needed things, making sure that everything was in good condition, was in operable condition, and stuff like that. But one of the things when we got into it in AIT that we all got a pretty good laugh out of, and it was related to communion, and it's not something that you would normally actually joke about because of the seriousness of the topic and all, but as one of my recent pastors used to say on a regular basis, and still says today quite regularly, God forbid we have fun in church. All right, but yeah, we got a good laugh out of this one, because when we got into talking about communion and serving communion and what all was entailed, one of the things that we would end up talking about was the wine portion or the drink portion. So standard operating procedure was that you would automatically consider pouring grape juice into the cups. All right, and generally speaking, yeah, that's the way it went. But you did have ministers, you did have chaplains of particular denominations, particular beliefs, and particular interpretations of Scripture that would require that you put wine on there. Now you can just imagine the kind of jokes that were made about that. All right, so you know you'd be ordering wine on the taxpayer's dollar. Um, they'd be saying, now when you're pouring this stuff and prepping for your services, don't be drinking it. Uh, and of course, when you're in a serious scenario and you're in a classroom and you're in a learning environment, when the teacher says that, of course, everybody cracks up. And when that happened, the jokes started. Everybody started cracking jokes about it. Uh, but that was always a fun thing because really, from one chaplain to the next, you never really know what they're going to want. So you just kind of have to go along and follow their lead on that. Um, Personally, myself, I never had a chaplain that wanted wine um for communion. They always went with the grape juice, and personally, I always agreed with that, mainly because of the fact that, well, soldiers are soldiers. Okay, those who didn't drink, uh, you know, it's just those that did. Yeah, well, the idea basically, and I mean, if it was just one of these little bitty cups with some wine in it, not a big deal. Nobody's gonna get drunk, or nobody's ability to perform on a military basis is going to be affected by one of those little cups. Um, but nevertheless, most of the chaplains just felt like that it really wasn't necessary. One, and two, they didn't want to run the risk of having that affect anybody's performance. Um, Plus, it was also cheaper to get the grape juice, and it was also a lot easier to get our hands on, and a lot easier to order it because it was more plentiful. So there were some practical reasons for doing that, but nevertheless, we always got a good laugh out of the whole wine thing for communion. Um, I know some people might not find that to be funny, but it is what it is. Um, so uh, now the images that I've been showing you so far have all been of a garrison environment where things are nice and clean and straightforward, and each liturgical item has its own particular uh, distinctive characteristics that were easy to distinguish between. But when you get into the field, it becomes a whole nother ball of wax. It becomes very generic. You don't have any crucifixes, you only have crosses. Um, but you still had all the similar type liturgical items that you were responsible for maintaining, keeping stock, taking care of, cleaning out, etc., etc., etc. Um, the little white plastic bottle over there, that was the grape juice bottle. um, and at the beginning of services, we would have the cups. The chaplain's assistant would stand at the back and hand out the cups to everybody as they came in, so that when it came time for communion, they would go up with their own personal little cup. I'd pour, or the minister or the priest or whoever would pour the grape juice into their cup, um, and that sort of thing. And then the little canister sitting behind that on top of the cloth there is where the wafers would be. Um, and that was even different too. Some chaplains would want your traditional wafers like you would expect to see in a Catholic service, while others would prefer that you get the what I call dehydrated bread, um, which basically looked like a chiclet, but it was bread that had been dehydrated. Um, so, but that's where those would be kept, and the chaplains would have this. Uh, this bag that they would be issued upon completing their chaplain's course at Fort Monmouth. And inevitably, even though it was theirs and they were issued it, the responsibility for taking care of it fell directly on the chaplain's assistant. So we had to maintain that thing. We had to order the supplies for it. We had to make sure that the grape juice wasn't bad, and all that kind of stuff. And what I mean by bad was that it wasn't fermenting. Um, so we were constantly ordering that kind of stuff all the time. Um, but just to give you an idea, in the field, services also look a little different, obviously. Um, and they kind of look a little something like this. Now, the individual who is holding the plate that these guys are either picking up or putting down their cups and stuff from the communion portion of it is actually a chaplain's assistant, or what would now be known as a religious support specialist. Um, Sometimes, and usually you're only going to do services in a scenario in which you are at a base or at a base camp or something to that effect, where you have security that's already being provided for you by the units that are there. Um, and then the soldiers are giving the option as to whether or not to attend services. If they want to attend services, then the chain of command can't really keep them from going to services except under very, very limited circumstances and conditions. Um, but nevertheless, when services were going on, it fell on the chaplain's assistant shoulders, and it's their responsibility to make sure that there is security for the service. So not only are they setting up for the service, not only are they assisting the chaplain during the services, but they're also in charge of the security. So either you're standing guard, or you designate certain people that are attending the service to stand guard. Um, so there's a lot of different things. And I mean, in a nutshell, a chaplain's assistant essentially uh, performs three general um general tasks for the unit ministry team. They are the supply and admin, i.e., kind of like an office manager. Um, it pretty much runs the office, orders supplies, all that kind of stuff. They are also the chaplain's bodyguard. So when you are actually in a combat zone or in a combat environment, the safety of the chaplain falls, the responsibility of the chaplain's safety falls directly onto the chaplain's assistant. Now, the reason for that is simply this, all right? Chaplains, by nature of their job performance and their duties and what they represent, um, are given the option as to whether or not they bear arms. In other words, there is a weapon in the arms room under the armorer's care that is designated for the chaplain. Most of the time, it's usually a pistol that's designated for the chaplain. However, it is completely up to the chaplain as to whether or not he actually uses it or takes it out of the armory or qualifies with it. They have that option. In my entire career in the military, there was one chaplain that I knew of who would actually draw his firearm and go to the range and actually qualify with the pistol. One, right? And I had numerous during my time as a chaplain's assistant and as my time as a medic. There was one chaplain that would actually bear arms. And I was curious about that one time, and I asked him, I said, sir, I said, with all the chaplains I've ever served with or been an assistant to, none of them would bear arms. And most of the time, it usually boiled down to the optics of it. Um, so I'm curious, for you, why do you choose to bear your arms? And the response he came back with wasn't surprising to me. Um, it was kind of expected, but nevertheless, it made perfect sense. He said, well, in the unit ministry team, there's only two of us. There's you and there's me. You have a weapon. You're responsible for my safety. What happens if you get shot and you're not able to defend me? Somebody's still got to defend me. So I need to be proficient with my weapon, and I need to know how to use it, because in a combat zone, nobody's going to care if I got a cross on my collar. And if you're down and can't defend me, I'm my only hope outside of God. So I choose to bear my arms to defend myself when necessary. And I personally had a lot of respect for that chaplain. And here's why. As I said, as a chaplain's assistant, you are responsible for the safety of the chaplain. Well, let me back up just a second. Um, Let me address a myth about being a chaplain's assistant. No matter what unit I was ever with, whether it was an artillery unit, an infantry unit, a mechanized unit, a tanker unit, a signal unit, it didn't matter what unit I was with. Every soldier I ever talked to, before they understood what it was that I actually did, all had the concept and the notion about a chaplain's assistant being a cushy job. Okay, and when I say a cushy job, I mean it's easy. There's nothing difficult about it. It's not hard. It's much easier than what the infantry guys do, because we don't have to get out there and do all the the ground and pound stuff. We don't have to do any of the artillery stuff. We don't have to stand guard duty. We don't have to do fire watches or anything like that. Um, and it never seemed like we got any of the mundane or the stupid tasks or the busy work. Um, what they didn't realize, though, was that we did. Um, if we didn't have things that were keeping us busy with the unit ministry team, whether that was doing um, uh, counseling sessions, whether that was doing hospital visits, whether that was doing chapel services, whether that was doing health and welfare checks, um, prepping, planning, scheduling, uh, supply stuff. If we weren't doing things like that, then, and we lived in the barracks, then yes, we would get things like fire watch and CQ duties and things of that nature. We would get them. Um, wasn't quite as often or as frequent, because we wouldn't be put into the rotation as much based on our schedules and various things. Like, for example, during Christmas time or Easter, um, or some of the major Christian holidays or some of the major Jewish holidays, um, at the time, because at the time those were the only two um, religious entities that had any kind of representation in the chaplaincy corps. Now you have Christianity, you have Judaism, you have Islam, you have Wicca, uh, and a few other religions that are represented in the chaplaincy corps now. I don't know if Hinduism or any of those or any of the Eastern religions have any representation or not. If any of you guys are active duty or in the military now and know the answer to that, um, do me a favor and let me know. I'm curious to find out about that fact and what religious denominations and religious influences are actually still present in the military, and what kind of proportions those are. That would be interesting for me. So if any of you guys watching know about that kind of stuff, please leave a comment in the comments and let me know about that. Anyway, back to what I was originally trying to get to. Sorry, I didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole and go down that tangent. But statistic wise, it has long been considered that the most dangerous job in the military, and when I say the most dangerous job in the military, I'm referring to life expectancy on the battlefield. In other words, when in combat, the life expectancy of a particular individual that is participating on the battlefield. If I were to say, who do you think had the highest casualty rates and had the shortest life expectancy in the military for all the jobs out there? Most likely you would automatically say, well, the infantry guy, because he's out there right at the front lines and actually engaged in combat with the enemy. And when I first started AIT, I said the same thing. I thought the same thing. It just seems to make sense. But then they informed us about something that really shocked me. And the reality is, chaplains' assistants have the shortest life expectancy in combat. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not. Yep. And they have the highest casualty rates. So, for example, during Vietnam, 50% of chaplains' assistants were killed in action. A even higher percentage of them were wounded in action. And the chaplains, they didn't really fare as well. Because in Vietnam, there were two targets the Vietnamese had. And they targeted these people first and foremost. They were the highest priority targets. There was the medics and the chaplain's assistants, or the chaplaincy corps, the chaplains. Okay? The reason for this, when you stop and think about it, it makes sense. It's a good strategy, it's a good tactic, but yeah, it's pretty offensive. All right, I'll give you that. But in a battle scenario, in a combat situation, it makes perfect sense. If you take out the spiritual figure, okay, it produces a sense of the unit is no longer protected by God. They don't have, God is not with them. God is not protecting them. Now that's not true, okay? That's straight up not true. But when your spiritual leader is gone and they were taken out by the enemy, it can feel that way. Now, take out a medic. Who's going to take care of the wounded? So the whole idea behind targeting these two types of people as the highest priority target, you're affecting the morale of the troops. You're affecting the morale of the fighters. And if they're not willing to fight as hard, or they don't have the morale to fight, then you win the war. So those two particular positions are a highest priority target on the battlefield. And with chaplain's assistants, our average life expectancy on the battlefield was 30 seconds. 30 seconds during Vietnam. Now you ask why. Because I'll agree, it's kind of hard to believe until you understand why. As I said, they are one of the highest priority targets on the battlefield. But now think about this. There's two people in the unit ministry team. The chaplain's assistant and the chaplain. And most chaplains don't carry a weapon. They don't carry a weapon by choice, even in combat. All right? So now you have a situation where you have two people, one weapon. Who's doing all the fighting? The chaplain's assistant, of course. Okay? So the chaplain assistant, being the bodyguard, being responsible for the safety of the chaplain, essentially is like the Secret Service, in the sense that if someone attacks the President of the United States, the Secret Service will jump in front of a bullet to protect the President. Well, guess what? That's the chaplain's assistant's job. Because believe it or not, according to the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, if a chaplain is wounded in battle and it is deemed that the chaplain's assistant could have prevented it, the chaplain's assistant gets a court-martial and ends up in Leavenworth and loses his career. That's how serious the military takes this stuff, or at least took it. I don't know if they take it that seriously anymore, but they did back then. So if you were a chaplain's assistant, you had to know your stuff. You had to not only know how to prep the chapels, to do the bulletins, to write letters, to prepare the chapel, prepare the liturgical items, keep everything in stock, but you also had to know how to fight. And I mean fight. A fight with double the ferocity of any infantryman, because you were the only one that could defend you and the chaplain. And if something happened to the chaplain, it was your backside. You were paying for it out of your hide. So you had to know it, and you had to know your job really well. So even though it appeared to be a cushy job, it wasn't. I can't tell you how many times I did 18 and 20-hour days as a chaplain's assistant that I never did as a medic. I mean, 12, 14, 16-hour days was a common occurrence being a chaplain's assistant. Everybody else would be getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning doing PT and then be released from duty and off duty by 4 or 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Most of us chaplain's assistants were still at the chapel and still in the office until 7 or 8 o'clock at night on a regular basis. You get out into the field and shoot, now you're talking, 20, 24-hour operations, because you're constantly running around back and forth between the units. You're having to do security type stuff. You're having to do communications via radio. I mean, it can be pretty arduous, and it's pretty hard. And it was as a chaplain's assistant where I learned how to do power naps to be able to continuously conduct these operations. So when I didn't have something that I needed to be doing while the chaplain, say, was talking to one of the company commanders or doing a counseling session or something like that, and I had no responsibilities that I had to do other than other than provide security on the way to the next location, because if I was providing security to the next location, the chaplain drove. Any other time, I drove. So I had to have a good driver's license. I had to have a good, clean driving record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was all part of the job. We even had some driver's training while we were in AIT for it. But nevertheless, in a combat scenario where I'm having to provide security, the chaplain drives. But anyway, I digress. So during those times where I didn't have any responsibilities and I was just waiting for the chaplain to finish up whatever he was doing at that particular unit, I would go sit in the vehicle and I would take a power nap, because chances are it might be 6, 7, 8 more hours before I even get another chance to even try and catch some shut eye. Uh, but yeah, it's a crazy life. It appears to be cushy, but most people in the military don't see everything that happens behind the scenes with a unit ministry team. They think, oh, well, they show up here, they show up there, they show up occasionally, they talk to us, they chit chat with us, they make us feel good, they make us laugh, stuff like that. And that's what they think the job is. But the job is so much more than that. So, yeah, I mean, it's so much more than that. And going back to what I mentioned briefly earlier, yeah, we handled all the administrative type stuff, like ordering supplies, writing letters, doing the bulletins. Yeah, and back then, you know, and that was part of our training in AIT, was learning how to type. If you didn't know how to type, you had to learn how to type, and you had to be able to type at least 35 words a minute with than one, uh, no more than one keystroke error, and no more than two grammatical errors, whether that be missing a period, missing a comma, or just something grammarly wrong with the structure of your sentence. You couldn't have any spelling errors, none whatsoever. And you had to learn how to do all this stuff on a typewriter back then. There were no computers yet. So there was no keyboards. It was a typewriter. So you were literally typing, and if you made a mistake, it was one of those typewriters where you could back up with the little correction tape. But during training and during your training, your typewriters had the correction tape removed, so you couldn't use it. So if you had to correct something, you had to use whiteout to white that out, go back and correct it. But because the typing tests were timed and you only had so much time to do, and you had to get to a particular point in the paragraph that you were having to retype, you didn't have time to make those corrections. So the errors just stood there, right? Because you just kept going, right? So you type. Man, that was the one thing going through AIT that I thought I was going to flunk. And the problem with that was, if you didn't pass, you didn't pass the course. That was an automatic failure if you weren't able to type 35 words a minute like that. So I got really concerned, especially coming up towards the finals and the testing for graduation. Because by the time we got close to graduation, I was still only doing 30 to 32 words a minute. And I was struggling to get that. My fingers just wouldn't work that fast, because up to that point, everything I had done was basically manual labor type stuff and didn't require the kind of fine motor skill coordination that typing requires. So for like 3 weeks prior to that final on the typing, every spare moment that I had where I wasn't keeping up with my PT, and like after chow time at dinner, I would spend 2 hours up in the classrooms just typing away, just typing anything that I could find. I would sit there and I would find it. I would set it up on the little mount there, the paper mount, and I would sit there and just type, and timing myself and stuff, and doing various typing tests. And amazingly enough, I managed to do it in that 3 to 4 week time frame where I did that. I managed to go from 32 words a minute to 38 to 40 words a minute. And when it came time for the test, I actually shocked myself. Again, it was kind of like the basic training thing, where I had 4 weeks where I wasn't able to do any PT, and came off profile the day before my final PT test, and ended up doing better on the final PT test than I did on my original PT test, and blew everybody's mind. Well, this same thing happened, because during that 3 to 4 week time frame where I was practicing every day, the best I ever did was 35 words a minute, but I had two errors on the spelling and two grammatical errors, and you know, it just, it was frustrating. I thought I wasn't going to pass, but then I got in there and I look at it and I just blanked out, and I just looked at letters, letter, and spaces and punctuation and that stuff, and that's what I focused on when I was looking at the sheet over here that was up on the stand. And I ended up coming out typing 40 words a minute with one grammatical error. That was it. And I was like, whew. So I graduated. But that's how I learned to type. And since then, I don't even know what I type anymore. I think at one point I got up to I think it was like 65 words a minute. But I'm not as focused on not having errors anymore as I used to be, and I probably should be, but I don't. I make typing errors all the time. But today it's so much easier to fix because you just backspace and type the right letter and keep going. So much easier on computers than it used to be with just doing typewriters. And so when I say we had to type letters and we had to do the bulletins and all that, we were doing all of that stuff on typewriters. So we had to have that stuff down, and you know, it is what it is. Um, so yeah, it just, you got used to it. You learned it, and you did what you had to do, or you didn't pass. So that was that aspect of it. But here's the one thing that I would honestly say makes being a chaplain and a chaplain's assistant the least cushiest job in the military. And I know a lot of people well, I'll show you, right? And that's funerals. Doing military funerals and notifications. If you're stateside, you're notifying families of family members passing away. That responsibility falls to you. It falls to the chaplain. And as a chaplain's assistant, guess where you're at? You're going with them. That may have changed since then, but back then, that's the way it was. We did the death notifications. We wrote the letters home. And I tell you what, that was one of the hardest jobs I've ever done in the military. One of the hardest things I've ever done. It's never easy. It never gets easy. And if it does, your heart's getting cold, and it's time to do something new. But I can't even remotely begin to tell you how many funerals, military funerals, that I participated in, that I put on, that I helped the chaplain with during my time in the military. Well, with that, I've only got about 6 minutes left. And that basically brings me to the Desert Storm time frame, because after completing AIT as a chaplain's assistant, I got assigned to a unit out in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. That was a medical clearing company. And I got assigned to that because I had been accepted to Oral Roberts University to go there, majoring in biblical literature, New Testament, minoring in Old, with the goal of one day becoming a preacher. Uh, but I ended up getting assigned to the Medical Clearing Company in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and that was a National Guard unit. That was the unit that I told you I got deployed with to go to Desert Storm, that gave me the Thunderbird patch. Well, that wore the Thunderbird patch. Um, and that's the unit that we tried to get them to let us wear the double Thunderbird. If you remember back when I first started talking about all this. My very first unit as a chaplain's assistant was the 146th Signal Battalion, which is over off of Normandy Boulevard, and they're still there. And the patch that we had at the time was that one up there at the top. The alligator patch there in the middle was the unit that I transferred to when I got back from Desert Storm, and I'll get into that a little bit more in the next episode or next couple of episodes, because it may take me a while to get through all the Desert Storm stuff. But I went to Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, got assigned to the 145th Medical Clearing Company, and that's where I did a few years of my time as a chaplain's assistant. Although I was a chaplain's assistant from 1988 all the way up into what was it, 97? No, 96. Yeah, so from 88 to 96 I was a chaplain's assistant, but I was enlisted from 87 and got out in 2005 with some changes in duty status and all that stuff. But anyway, that's coming later on down the road. But with all that said about my chaplain's assistant's training in AIT, it brings me up to my Desert Storm stuff. The Desert Storm stuff will transition, do some, and we'll go through a bunch of things there. My experiences there during the war, the things that I saw, the things that I did, things that changed my life forever, things that made me make different decisions, make some bad decisions, make a decision that I still regret to this day. And just an overview of Desert Storm, and give you some specifics and whatnot regarding that experience, because it's during that time that I got the motivation to become a medic later on and change my MOS to be a medic. But anyway, before I close off and before I forget, if you look in the upper left-hand corner over, let's see, where I'm, oh yeah, so over there, oh, over there in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a crest there that has a dove and then what looks like a book that's open. Well, that's the Bible, the dove representing the Holy Spirit. Underneath it, it has the words Pro Deo et Patria. That means for God and country. And that was the Chaplaincy Corps' motto back then. And that was the Corps or the regimental insignia that we wore. There was another one that I wore as a chaplain's assistant that denoted me as the assistant, that had the praying hands like this, that had a chapel right in the center there. And that denoted me as a chaplain's assistant. And the chaplain, of course, would have the cross or the Ten Commandment tablets, denoting whether or not they were Christian or Jewish at the time. So that's that. Anyway, I'm out of time. I don't. Yep. I don't see anybody that's online, so I will skip the question and answer time at this time. When we get some viewers that are watching live, I'll open those up again. But for now, you guys have a great evening. Enjoy your weekend. I'm going to be headed up to Savannah to do a wedding this weekend. So we will see you all next week. And next week, we'll be talking about Desert Storm and what it was like for me during that time and what that experience was like. So thank you very much. And don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified of when I schedule more of these events. And don't forget to comment. All of those things will help with the YouTube algorithm to get these videos seen by more people. So don't forget to do that stuff for me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It will help us out immensely. And with that, have a good night, and we'll see you next week.